The freezing Arctic wind stung the bare skin of a boy's face as he trudged through the snow alongside his dad, Mike, his uncle, Jerry, and their dog, Scout. That icy breeze howled past, cutting right through the air while the deep snow crunched loudly beneath their boots. They were bundled up tight in layers of fur and leather, with thick straps pulled snug to keep out the cold. "How much farther?" the boy, Ethan, asked, his teeth chattering so hard it was tough to get the words out. No one replied at first. Uncle Jerry finally stopped, crouched down, and looked him in the eye. "We're almost on its trail, but we need to be quiet and careful. If it hears us coming, it might come for us instead." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded, doing his best to hide the fear crawling up his spine. They kept moving, their steps crunching in rhythm, while Scout leapt through the snow, stopping now and then to sniff at the wind. Suddenly, a fierce gust whipped up the powdery snow, and Scout froze, letting out a low, menacing growl. The dog bared its teeth at the swirling flurries, which were getting thicker by the second. The group halted, watching Scout's every move. Mike and Jerry used hand signals to communicate, but Ethan couldn't make sense of them. Before he could ask, a strange sound reached their ears. It started soft, almost too faint to notice, but grew louder and louder until it overpowered even the wind. It was laughter, cold, hollow, and haunting. The sound sent a shiver through Ethan that had nothing to do with the weather. The laughter came in eerie bursts of three, each one twisting his insides a little tighter. Scout's fur stood on end, and the dog whipped around to face the group. Its mouth frothed with saliva that froze into jagged icicles as it snarled and barked. Without warning, the dog lunged at Ethan. There was a blur of motion, and suddenly red stained the white snow. Scout let out one final, agonized yelp and fell silent. Mike stood still as a statue, gripping the spear he had used to end the dog's madness. His voice was steady, almost a whisper. "It's here." Without another word, he pulled the spear free, and they pressed on. The laughter returned, deeper now, reverberating in Ethan's chest. Mike told him to cover his ears, and he obeyed, keeping his hands pressed tight against his head as they moved. Soon, they came across tracks in the snow. Massive, barefoot prints marked with frozen, dark blood. Drag marks trailed alongside each step, as if the creature had been pulling something heavy with it. Ethan's fear bubbled up like a rising tide, and his body trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer terror gnawing at his insides. The wind carried another wave of those awful chuckles. He pressed harder against his ears, but the sound still broke through. Looking down at his boots, he tried to avoid the sight of those bloody footprints. Before long, he bumped into Mike, who had stopped dead in his tracks. His dad gave no signal, said nothing, just grunted and nodded ahead. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest as his eyes followed the direction of the nod. Near a snow-covered boulder stood a figure. A man, but not a man at all. The thing was skeletal, its skin pale and almost glowing in the dim light. Ice crystals clung to its jagged flesh, which was marred by blackened frostbite and ugly purple blotches. Rotted scraps of fur hung loosely off its body, leaving most of it exposed to the brutal cold. Long strands of frozen, dark hair draped over its face, barely concealing a pair of wide, unblinking eyes, milky white and void of pupils. A crooked grin stretched across its cracked, bluish lips, with a streak of brown liquid oozing from the corners of its mouth, dripping down its gaunt jaw. The creature's head shifted left, then right, before it crouched down. That dreadful laugh spilled out of its twisted mouth again, low and guttural, as it fiddled with something on the ground. The three of us, Ethan, Mike, and Jerry, stood frozen in place, trying to figure out what the thing was doing. Then, like a thunderclap, realization hit Ethan. He gasped loudly, tears spilling over his face and freezing to his skin in the biting cold. What lay before the creature was beyond horrific. His mother and sister, lifeless and tangled together in a dark pool of blood. Their fur-lined clothing was shredded, exposing jagged wounds and torn flesh. What haunted Ethan most wasn't the blood or the wounds. It was their faces. Their eyes stared wide open, glassy and lifeless. and their mouths twisted into the same unsettling grin plastered across the creature's face. The questions of their fate were answered in the cruelest way possible. Then came the wet, sickening sounds. The creature bent lower, gnawing and tearing at their remains. It slurped and chewed, oblivious to the three horrified figures watching it. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts as he struggled to keep from sobbing, but it was too much. A choked cry escaped his lips, cutting through the freezing air. Jerry reacted instantly, clamping a hand over Ethan's mouth. "Quiet," he hissed, his voice sharp with fear. "You have to stay quiet." But it was too late. The creature froze, its head snapping toward them in a sharp, unnatural movement. Blood dripped from its cracked, blue lips as its hollow, pale eyes locked onto the group. Slowly, it straightened to its full, towering height. There wasn't time to think. Mike roared, his voice echoing through the snow-covered clearing, and charged forward, spear gripped tightly in his hands. Jerry followed close behind, barking at Ethan to stay put. The two men hurtled toward the thing, their boots crunching through the snow. Mike lunged first, but the spear missed its mark. The creature moved with an eerie, inhuman speed, knocking him to the ground with a bony hand. In one swift motion, it grabbed Jerry by the neck and hoisted him off the ground. The creature laughed, a sound so chilling it seemed to freeze the air. Its free hand rose, spreading unnaturally long fingers tipped with jagged, black claws. Ethan couldn't look anymore. He squeezed his eyes shut and clamped his hands over his ears, tears streaming down his cheeks. When he opened his eyes again, the snow was splattered with blood. Jerry's crumpled body lay lifeless, his face frozen in a grotesque smile. Mike fought valiantly, but the struggle sent all three crashing onto the brittle sheet of ice beneath them. The sound of cracking grew louder, the ice splintering in long, jagged lines. None of them realized until it was too late. With a deafening snap, the ice gave way, and Mike and the creature plunged into the frigid waters below. Ethan sat paralyzed, unable to move as he watched his father sink. The grief crushed him, but what truly terrified him was the sight of the creature. Its pale face lingered beneath the surface, those unblinking eyes staring up at him through the water. Its lips curled into a twisted grin, and its final laugh echoed in his mind as it disappeared into the icy depths. Ethan was left alone in the frozen wilderness, the silence deafening around him. The glowing digits of Rick Elner's alarm clock clicked from 6:59 to 7 o'clock, and Burl Ives's cheerful voice filled the room, singing, "Have a holly jolly Christmas." "God damn it. Shut up," Rick shouted, slamming the off button. He swung his legs out of bed and grabbed the whiskey bottle from the dresser. Without bothering with a glass, he took a long swig. The burn spread down his throat, warming his gut, but did nothing to ease the bitterness in his chest. He shoved his feet into his boots, muttering to himself, "Merry damn Christmas." The shrill ring of the phone in the hallway snapped him out of his thoughts. He grabbed the receiver and growled, "Yeah?" The voice on the other end was curt. "Rick, he's back." Rick's brow furrowed. "Who's back?" "Angel Maker," the voice said flatly. Rick's jaw clenched. He grabbed a pen and a notepad. "Give me the address." He scribbled the details, hung up the phone, and headed out the door. The winter air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. His car roared to life, the exhaust puffing out into the cold. Rick drove through the frost-covered streets of Alevandril, a town he'd lived in his whole life. Christmas decorations lined the streets, unlit lights, wreaths, inflatable Santas. Kids were building snowmen in front yards, their laughter carried on the wind. Rick hated it all. For most people, Christmas was a time for joy and family. For Rick, it was a time for grief, regret, and loneliness. 3 years ago, his wife and kids had left him just before Christmas. Since then, the holiday had only been a reminder of his failures. His thoughts drifted to Angel Maker, the monster who turned his town into a nightmare. 9 victims, all found the same way. Mutilated, bloodied, and posed in the snow with wings carved beneath them. Rick had chased the killer relentlessly, but Angel Maker always disappeared after the 9th kill. leaving nothing behind but fear and frozen corpses. The case had consumed Rick. It drove him to the bottle, and the bottle drove his family away. Now, with the first snowfall, the killer was back. This time, Rick swore he'd stop him. Rick pulled up to the edge of Boys Park. A crowd had already gathered near the caution tape. The radio in his car blared a news report. Despite the freezing temperatures, the polar ice caps continued to melt, sending waves of water and huge chunks of ice. Rick turned the car off and stepped out. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the relentless news reporter who had received a broken jaw the last time he tried to interview Rick, back when he was working a case last year. Once he made his way past the tape and a couple of local cops, Rick's partner, Mike Thompson, shuffled toward him. "About damn time you got here." "This one's different," Mike said, his stocky frame hustling Rick toward the crime scene. In a brutal display of savagery lay the body of a young woman. She was sprawled out on the snow, her body posed with angel wings beneath her, blood covering her form. Her abdomen was slashed open, and frozen entrails hung out, arranged in the shape of a bow. Christmas lights were wrapped around her neck, which was also slashed open. It was the same sick signature that Rick had come to dread. But this time, something was off. Female, early 20s, maybe younger. Like always, her throat and stomach were slashed. The angel maker left his mark and decorated her body. "But take a look at this," Mike said, pointing toward the woman's face. Rick's eyes followed Mike's hand, and his stomach sank. The poor woman's eyes were gone, replaced by jagged pieces of a shattered mirror. They were jammed in her face, cruelly embedded. "Sick son of a bitch," Rick muttered under his breath. Mike went on to give more details, then asked, "What do you think the mirrors mean?" Rick didn't have an answer. Instead, he scanned the scene, noticing something unusual. Only one set of footprints. There were two prints near the woman's feet, like the killer had stood there to admire his work. It was a repeating detail from previous cases. In the past, shoe prints were taken, but nothing ever came through. But there was something else this time. Part of the woman's hair had been removed, and her pinky finger was gone. This was consistent with previous victims, as Angel Maker always took a piece of his victims. But two parts this time? A year had passed since the last string of murders, and this one happened on the same day as the previous years. But it felt different. Rick told himself that this would be the last time he saw this monster's work. The two men left the scene and headed for a coffee shop to discuss the latest development. The victim fit the same profile as the others. A respected and loved person, kidnapped from another state, then found mutilated and desecrated by Alevandro's infamous serial killer. All the victims had come from nearby states and were dumped in Maine. The first body of the year was always left in a public space for everyone to see, but the others were left in more remote areas around town. However, all the bodies were found within the town limits. That had led authorities to believe that the Angel Maker was a local, but despite years of investigation, no suspects or evidence had been found. Rick stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his thoughts racing. Mike continued to talk, detailing the case, but Rick's mind was elsewhere. That was until Mike pointed out that this new victim had been found only 10 yards from the first body. Rick froze. He had been so focused on the crime scene that he hadn't noticed the location. Later that night, Rick stayed up late, sipping on a bottle of Jack Daniels and going over the case files from the first Angel Maker killings. The pieces started to fall into place. His focus was sharp, and he was determined to catch this deranged psychopath. A week had passed since the discovery of the woman in Boys Park, and Rick hadn't found any new clues. His frustration was growing, especially after another victim was discovered. His enemy had struck again. The second bloody snow angel was found near Olive Creek, and Rick quickly realized it was the same place as the second victim from the first year. The only difference was that this new woman was found on the opposite side of the water. This poor woman had her heart ripped out, and in its place was a glass ornament shaped like a cartoon heart. The shiny object reflected Rick's angry face. God damn it, how did no one see anything? Rick muttered to himself. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder. I don't know, Rick. We're just lucky I was out on a walk and found her. We'll get him this time. A cold breeze cut through the air, stinging Rick's face. He shook it off, standing tall. Let's go, Mike. We need to go through the files. If he's repeating his first kills, we know where the next one will be. Mike followed him to the car. The two detectives drove toward the station, and the radio interrupted their thoughts with another news bulletin. More and more melted water is causing floods in. Static crackled, then the announcer's voice returned. Large chunks of ice have drifted toward areas such as... Just then, the CB radio buzzed to life. Detective Elner, please respond to a code J01. Without hesitation, Rick grabbed the receiver. This is Elner. We're on it. Location? The two detectives exchanged looks, thinking it was another Angel Maker scene. Even though it seemed too soon, their thoughts shifted as they drove toward the outskirts of town. Near the welcome sign of Alavandrel, crumpled in the fetal position, was a body. Unlike the other victims of the Angel Maker, there was no angelic figure of snow surrounding this corpse. The man was fully clothed, save for the large gashes and cuts around his back and chest. There were no major wounds, no replaced organs, and no Christmas decorations. This victim was male, a first in the series of killings. The detectives, Rick and TJ, knelt down to examine the scene, questions filling their minds. Blood had frozen to the fabric of the man's clothing and to the snow beneath him, and deep cuts marred his flesh. But the wounds, despite their severity, were not deep enough to be fatal. Once the photos were taken and the body was ready to be moved, the coroner gasped. Rick and TJ both raised an eyebrow in unison. TJ muttered softly, "What in the hell?" Stretched across the man's face was a ghastly smile, the corners of his mouth cracked and showing every tooth, stained with brown sludge. His eyes were wide open, devoid of color, with only enlarged pupils. The sight was grotesque, more like a Halloween mask than a living person's face. The body was placed in a bag and hauled off to the station. Rick arrived home around 2 in the morning, still scratching his head over the new development. Could Angel Maker have changed his tactics? Could this be an extra kill, or had another serial killer emerged in town? Rick's mind swirled with questions and theories, but none of them offered answers. He found the only solace at the bottom of a liquor bottle. 2 days later, another smiling corpse was discovered. It followed the same pattern as the first, but this time, it was an elderly woman. With TJ on a different call, Rick was alone during his examination. The sight of the woman's smiling, decrepit face left him uneasy. The more he focused on it, the more unsettling it became. Then, without warning, a low murmur filled his ears, a dry, emotionless laugh, almost like morbid sarcasm. It seemed to tickle his ear, and Rick looked in all directions, but saw no one. He thought it might be his mind playing tricks, but as he left the scene, the hollow chuckle seemed to accompany the cold wind. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, and in that time, 3 more girls were discovered, along with 4 more smiling bodies. To add to the growing unease, sting operations had been set up in hopes of catching Angel Maker. The latest bodies were found near the same areas where the first victims had been discovered. But despite multiple squad cars conducting reconnaissance, there were no sightings of the killer. Only after the authorities left did the bodies appear, as if Angel Maker was watching and knew when the police had left. Things were becoming increasingly strange, with more questions than answers. Rick noticed that his partner, TJ, seemed to always be the one discovering the bodies or arriving first at the scene. Even stranger were the smiling faces of the dead, which slowly moved from the outskirts of town toward the heart of Alavandrel. Rick was starting to feel like he was losing his mind. Every body he examined seemed to come with that dry, crackling laugh, carried by the wind. And in the background, he swore he saw a strung-out junkie, a tall, lanky man barely dressed, his body covered in sick boils and pustules. A horrific smile marred his face, hidden only by long strands of dark hair. Rick tried to question the junkie, but by the time he approached, the man had vanished. Rick spoke to TJ about the strange figure, but it brought no closure. Then, a series of cataclysmic events unfolded. The first was when TJ abruptly left a meeting and forgot his keys in Rick's car. Rick noticed the keys later that night after his shift. He grabbed them, deciding to drop them off at TJ's house. That's when something caught his eye, a small gold pendant with a tiny diamond at the center. To Rick's knowledge, TJ had never been married, nor was he in any relationship. While Rick didn't interact with his partner much outside of work, he thought he knew enough about TJ's life. That night, Rick stopped by TJ's residence, leaving the keys in the mailbox. He couldn't help but notice the multiple ornaments and angels decorating the lawn. At the time, it seemed like nothing, just holiday decorations. But as he lay in bed, the cases swirling in his mind, something clicked. The pendant. He had seen it before. The image haunted his mind, refusing to leave. Sleep didn't come. So, Rick headed to the station early, determined to dig through the case files on Angel Maker. The papers and photos of the poor, desecrated women cluttered his desk. Rick drank heavily from a bottle hidden in a drawer. His mind swirled with frustration, and his anger bubbled up like water. He slammed his fist down on the desk. Slowly, a photo slid from the pile and landed on the floor. He picked it up and scanned it. Elizabeth Coulter, the first victim, found before Angel Maker had even gotten his name. Her body had been gutted and wrapped with garland at the front steps leading to the fountain at Boys Park. The memories burned bright in Rick's mind. And then, it hit him. He looked more closely at the photos. There it was. The small gold heart with the tiny diamond. Rick choked on the bourbon as he stared at the sight. Son of a bitch. Questions and theories started to form in his mind. Without thinking, Rick grabbed his coat and stormed out of the station. He was heading back to TJ's. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for sure. His partner had tampered with evidence. Rick couldn't stand for that. He had one more thought, but he prayed it wasn't true. He pulled into the driveway, noticing that TJ's car was still gone and all the lights were off. Where the hell is he at 4 in the morning? Rick muttered aloud as he exited his car. He walked up the steps, holster unbuttoned, hands searching the mailbox. The keys were still inside. Without a thought, Rick unlocked the door and stepped inside. At first, the living room appeared ordinary, but as Rick flicked on his flashlight, he saw the multitude of angelic figures and Christmas decorations that lined the walls. Given the murders, the decorations now seemed morbid. He crept through the other rooms, unsure of what he was searching for. Never having been inside this house, the layout was unfamiliar to him. Then, he froze. A thud echoed from below. Moments later, it was followed by a muffled whine. His instincts kicked in. Rick made his way toward the sound, finding a door near the kitchen locked. The key hung on the keychain, allowing him entry. He descended slowly into a damp, musty basement. The lights flickered overhead, and the faint sounds grew louder. A sick feeling crept up Rick's spine as he took in the room's unsettling contents. Along the walls were clippings from the Angel Maker case, photographs, articles, and notes meticulously pinned up. On the far side of the room stood an altar. Angels splattered with red and black paint, with unlit candles scattered nearby. Jewelry and severed fingers, some decayed and withered, were arranged in twisted patterns. Then the whimpering grew louder, snapping Rick's attention to the left. He dropped his flashlight. There, in front of him, was a naked woman, tied to a blood-stained mattress. A blindfold covered her eyes, and a rag was stuffed in her mouth. Blood crusted her nostrils, and she squirmed weakly, crying in terror. "Jesus Christ," Rick whispered. He rushed to her, removing the rag. The woman coughed violently before letting out a scream, her panic contagious. It took time to calm her down, and though she spoke frantically, her words were incoherent. Suddenly, footsteps echoed above. The unmistakable sound of TJ's voice called out, "Rick? Where are you, buddy?" The flashing blue and red lights illuminated Rick's face as paramedics loaded the woman into an ambulance. The chaos of the past 2 hours felt like a blur. What remained was the stark image of TJ, eyes wide, blood splattered, life drained away in Rick's hands. He had strangled his partner. He couldn't help it. After everything he had uncovered, the bastard deserved it. Rick justified it as self-defense, though the law might see it differently. The gray area surrounding TJ's death wasn't lost on him. He had taken out Angel Maker, but in doing so, Rick had killed his own partner, a man he once trusted. The basement was a crime scene now. Police found mementos from each of the victims. Pieces of hair, severed appendages, photographs before and after their gruesome deaths. The case had finally been solved. Detective Rick Elner was both a hero and a murderer. Poetic justice, if there ever was any. Rick spent the next week drinking away the relief that barely lasted. He flipped through channels on the TV, but the peace didn't last. The nation continues to find large chunks of ice floating in different regions. The news anchor droned, but the sound was drowned out by a cold rush of realization. Rick flipped to the next channel. His blood ran cold as the story unfolded. In the backyard of the infamous angel maker, formerly Detective Trevor Jameson, the body of a young boy was discovered. Rick's grip tightened on the remote. The boy's body was described in grim detail: torn clothing, deep cuts, blood splattered everywhere. The most chilling detail: a glued smile carved into the boy's face. For a brief moment, Rick had believed the smile murders were part of TJ's sick game. But now, with the body discovered after TJ's death, Rick felt the weight of his dread. It couldn't have been TJ's final kill. No. If the body had been there, it would have been found the night Rick killed his partner. But someone else had slain that boy. Although Rick couldn't directly involve himself in the case anymore, he knew he had to go. After a few shots of bourbon, he climbed into his car. The streets were slick with sleet, patches of black ice making the drive treacherous. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s. The road swayed beneath him as the alcohol clouded his mind. Rick swerved, narrowly missing a parked car on the side street near TJ's neighborhood. Finally, he reached the house, swarming with police cars. Yellow tape whipped in the wind, the chill biting at his skin. Snow crunched beneath his feet as he trudged toward the backyard. Images of the girl and TJ's dying face haunted his mind, but he shook them off. He pushed forward. The scene was just as the news had described, but seeing it in person was worse. The teenager was left in a gruesome display, discarded like trash. That smile, the same horrible smile, made Rick's stomach churn. A shiver ran down his spine. He tried to gather more details, but he was reminded once again of his lack of involvement in the case. Frustrated, Rick turned to leave, heading back toward his car. But something stopped him. His eyes caught movement near the trees bordering the house. He paused. There, standing in the shadows, was the junkie. The same man he'd seen lurking at the scenes of the smiling murders. Bastard, Rick muttered to himself. He wasn't going to let the guy slip away this time. The figure turned and began walking with an odd, jerking motion. The wind picked up, and with it came a dry, hollow laugh that filled the air. Rick's blood boiled. "You think the death of a child is funny, you son of a bitch?" he shouted, anger surging through him. He felt steam rise from his body, a fierce determination to stop this man. Though his gun and badge had been taken away due to his suspension, Rick didn't care. Would the world really miss another murderer? He thought. He had already taken care of Angel Maker with his own hands. If this man was guilty, he would do it again. Rick pushed through the snow-covered branches, struggling to maintain sight of the man ahead. His footsteps were muffled by the wind, the sound of laughter growing louder with each step. Finally, after a few minutes, he reached a small clearing, a pocket of woods where conifers and stones lay covered in sleet. There, sitting on a rock, was the man. Rick could hardly believe his eyes. The junkie was a sickly sight, a lanky frame covered in frostbite and oozing brown pus. His skin, pale and blue, was dotted with abrasions that had crystallized. He wore no shoes, no real clothes, only tattered animal furs. The man sat motionless, chuckling to himself as his elongated nails dug into an open sore on his body. The wet sloshing of the action made Rick wince. "Don't move, you sick bastard," Rick barked, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Laughing at the dead? You're coming with me." At the sound of Rick's voice, the man slowly lifted his head, his movement stiff and robotic. His eyes were entirely white, devoid of emotion, an eerie void that seemed to pierce straight through Rick. Then the man rose to his feet, revealing an ungodly height. Rick had to tilt his head upward to look at him. A twisted smile stretched from ear to ear, exposing jagged, ivory teeth. As the clouds above parted, the sunlight reflected off the man's skin, creating a sickening shimmer. Rick's stomach turned. He regretted not bringing a weapon. His heart raced with fear, but he stood his ground. He balled his fists, preparing for a fight. But before he could move, the thing was on him. The laughter rang in Rick's ears as sharp nails sank into his skin. The sensation was a mix of burning and an uncontrollable tickle, a feeling that sent shivers through his body. In an odd turn of events, Rick began to laugh, his nerves overwhelmed by the strange sensation. The woods filled with a cacophony of laughter, the sound of struggle echoing through the trees. On the morning of Christmas, a woman sat in her living room, watching as her two children tore through their presents. The TV was left on for background noise when a breaking news story interrupted. A male news reporter's voice filled the room. Early this morning, the body of Detective Rick Elner was discovered in Harbinger Woods, behind Allister Avenue, near the residence of the late Trevor Jameson, better known as the Angel Maker. Elner had been the lead investigator in the recent case, uncovering Jameson's crimes and eliminating the killer after discovering a woman chained in his basement, likely his next victim. Elner's body was discovered with lacerations across his torso, left in the snow. Due to the nature of his injuries, police have classified him as the latest victim in the growing series of Smiling murders. The woman paused, rolling the wedding ring around her necklace as tears began to form in her eyes. Her children, oblivious to the news, walked over to her. "Mommy," one of them asked, "do you think Daddy will come visit us for Christmas? Or is he still on the naughty list?" The woman blinked back her tears, forcing a smile as she wiped her face. She looked at her children, their innocent faces beaming with excitement over their new toys, completely unaware of the nightmare that had unfolded. Her heart sank. How could she explain to them that their father, a man they would never see again, had been taken from them in such a brutal way? She hugged them close, holding them tight as the news anchor continued in the background, offering little comfort as they speculated on the events. The house felt colder now, the festive decorations around them a stark contrast to the grim reality outside. The wind howled against the windows, a chilling reminder of the winter that had come and gone with no mercy. She tried to push the thoughts from her mind, but they lingered like the frost on the panes. Meanwhile, in the heart of Alevandrel, a quiet tension settled over the town. The gruesome murders had stopped, at least for now, but no one was fooled. A shadow loomed over the town, the memory of what had happened too fresh, too horrifying to forget. People locked their doors earlier, whispered in hushed tones in the streets, and a sense of unease had settled in even as they tried to celebrate the holiday. Detective Rick Elner, once a hero, had been found. He had stopped the Angel Maker, taken down the man who had terrorized the town for so long. But what had Rick become in the process? Was he truly a hero, or had he crossed a line that could never be undone? Was he just another casualty of a sick game that had no real winner? In the woods behind TJ's house, the place where Rick had died, something stirred. The snow had begun to melt, the ground beneath it softening with each passing day. Yet, as the days dragged on, strange occurrences began to surface once again. The first was a series of unexplained footprints found deep in Harbinger Woods, leading to the same spot where Rick had fallen. Then, a local farmer swore he had seen a figure, a tall, thin man with white, empty eyes, standing at the edge of his property late one night. But when the farmer approached, the figure was gone, disappearing into the trees as though swallowed by the night itself. In the following days, more reports came in. Odd whispers, strange sightings, and fleeting glimpses of a man with a grotesque smile etched across his face, lurking just beyond the edges of town. The thing that had taken Rick's life wasn't gone. It was still here, watching, waiting, and it wasn't alone. That night, as the town tried to sleep, an unsettling sound filled the air. It was a laugh, dry and hollow, carried by the wind. It echoed through the streets, bouncing off the empty buildings, a sound both familiar and wrong. But this time, it wasn't the junkie. It wasn't the thing Rick had chased. It was something else, something older, more malevolent, a presence that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows, and now it was coming for them. As the sun set over Alevandrel, the woman sat alone in her living room, her children asleep at her side. Her thoughts drifted back to the news report, to the final image of Rick Elner's lifeless body. A man who had given everything to protect this town, only to fall victim to its darkness. She had lost him, but now there was something far worse to fear. The laughter that had followed Rick's death was just the beginning. Somewhere out there, in the dark, the real game was only just starting. And this time, no one would be able to stop it. The phone rang. She didn't need to look at the caller ID. She already knew who it was. Hello? Her voice was shaky, too soft. The voice on the other end was chillingly familiar. "It's not over," the voice whispered. "We're not done yet." Then the line went dead.